Hi, and welcome to the April installment of the version 1 Microsoft product licensing terms update. How's everybody doing today?
Very good, thank you.
Good, thanks, Carl.
Good. So quite a few updates this month to run through. Lots of change, some interesting ones in there this month, it's probably fair to say. First up was the universal terms for online services. William, I know you've looked at that one.
I did, yeah. So this is specifically for Azure OpenAI service and online service integrations. So that Microsoft have updated the terms, basically where services are specifically using Azure OpenAI services. And the changes are for use limitations, data use and access, and third-party claims. And it really just says that if you're integrating Azure OpenAI services into using online service integrations, then you're giving up the rights to protect your own data in that sense. So I think it's quite a strong one. It's a bit like meaning that Microsoft can use the data that goes through the OpenAI services for analytics monitoring, and also, quite importantly, prevention of online abuse and misrepresentation. So it's just a tightening of the OpenAI service universal terms.
Very good. The next one then was on all things Azure Hybrid Benefit. So I'll take that one. So I suppose we look at hybrid benefit. The product terms are focusing on Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server and for SQL Server. If we look at SQL Server, first of all, there was no major change here. It was really just down to what Microsoft called improved readability of the product terms. So there's no material change in terms of what your use rights are with regards to SQL Server. For Windows Server, slightly different. So anybody who's looked at Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server before the 1st of April of this year, Microsoft had a number of caveats in terms of how you can apply the benefit. So the first one was that you had to have a minimum of 16 core licenses assigned before you could start to leverage Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server. So that could be 16 core licenses for Windows Server Standard or Windows Server Data Center. As of the 1st of April, Microsoft have actually removed that minimum threshold of 16 cores, and you can now begin to leverage Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server with 8 cores, which is quite useful. Another useful addition to that, or sorry, another key consideration here is that Microsoft still stipulate that you need to have a minimum of 8 Windows Server core licenses with either software assurance active or that they've been purchased as a server subscription to obtain the benefit. So you need to apply a minimum of 8 cores, should I say, to each Azure VM. So you can't take that 8 cores and split it between 2 4-core VMs. You've still got to assign 8 cores regardless of the number of cores if it's below 8. Another addition or another change that Microsoft have also made with regards to Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server is they've added some flexibility in terms of how you can stack licenses on top of each other, where, say, for example, you've got more than 8 cores. In the past, you needed to stack those licenses in packs of 8. Now Microsoft are actually allowing a greater level of flexibility. So say, for example, you have a Azure VM that has, say, 12 cores, instead of having to go and assign another 8 cores to that individual VM to obtain the rights to have 12 cores, but you're never actually going to use that full benefit. What Microsoft are now saying as of the 1st of April is that you can assign your 8 core licenses, and then you can top that up by a further 4 core licenses to make sure to allow you to be licensed correctly, but without creating a situation where you've got an excessive number of cores for a smaller Azure VM. So a couple of useful changes, probably fair to say, this month on Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server, which are worth noting. I'm always talking about how Azure Hybrid Benefit is a trust-based model, so it's really important that you take these new licensing terms and see how they impact on your use of Azure Hybrid Benefit today. So next up, I think, was Windows Desktop Operating Systems. I'm not sure who's had a look at that one.
Yeah, I had a look at it, Carl, and where Microsoft they've updated and rebranded an online service name from Windows Update Compliance to Windows Update for Business Reports. Now, at first, I kind of thought that was something to do with the Get Compliant. That we used to have in the past for kind of Windows OS, but it actually it's an online service where essentially Microsoft they let you kind of like use lots of diagnostic reporting for any devices that you have that are enrolled in Azure Active Directory. So look, it's kind of the same kind of service with just like a rebrand to Windows Update for Business Reports, and lots of kind of good stuff in there anyway that they're saying in terms of managing devices. And I guess it's kind of timely, well, not timely, but it's kind of related that a licensing brief came out last month in March for Windows 11 in virtualization scenarios. But I'll have a chat about that later on. Thanks, Carl.
Okay, interesting one. Richard, Windows Server. I know you spent a bit of time looking at some of the updates on Windows servers. There's some, again, a bit like the Azure Harbor Benefit, a bit of change there. That's definitely worth noting.
Let me just read out the change first, and maybe we can go through it one at a time. So, Microsoft essentially said they eliminated the requirement that customers start with 16 licenses before licensing by individual virtual OSC. And then they added a clause that states CSP customers may run Windows Server Data Center images with Windows Server Standard licenses when licensing by virtual OSC and following standard edition use rights. So that's another thing we will talk about. So on the first piece, in the past, what Microsoft the rules for licensing Windows Server was that you had to license a physical host first for the total number of cores it had, or for a minimum of 8 cores per processor, or 16 cores per server, whichever one was greater. Then once that server is licensed, then you have the right to host 2 virtual OSCs on the physical server. Now, with this rule change, there's no requirement to rely on licensing the physical host or even know how many cores the physical host has. As long as you license with a minimum of 8 cores per virtual OSC, you're fine. So, and by the way, I should mention this does not really impact Windows Server Data Center Essentials. Is mainly Windows Server Standard. So let's look at a very quick scenario. So imagine you have a server with 32 cores, and you want to license it for Windows Server Standard and also to virtual servers on that. In the past, you would have had to license the full 32 cores on that server because it's greater than a minimum of 16 cores per server. And then you get your rights for the 2 virtual OSCs. With this, you can just license each individual OSC with an 8-core minimum, and that saves you 16 cores. So that's a huge change in that regards, and it will allow stacking to be easier as well. And I'm sure in the long run, if you have more virtual environments on a server, it makes it easier and cheaper for you to license on a per virtual OS instance rather than licensing the physical host and then getting your rights for 2. Then the other portion of this change was that they said CSP customers may run Windows Server Data Center images with Windows Server Standard licenses. So essentially what this means is that customers with Windows Server Standard subscription licenses that they've purchased through the CSP and assigned on a virtual OSC basis may run Windows Server Data Center images instead of standard images. Now, there are conditions that govern this. Number one, the customer may run data center images as guest OSs only. Customers must use its existing Windows Server Data Center activation infrastructure to activate data center guests. So maybe a KMS server, or access the data center guests provided by cloud solution provider Oster. And of course, the Windows Server Standard use rights still apply. This allows customers who've purchased Windows Server Standard through a CSP to host data center without being what's the word, without being penalized in an audit scenario for using a data center image, whereas they're using a Windows Server standard rights. So this helps our customers who may have purchased Windows Server using a CSP. So those are the two changes. And I should also stress that these changes are kind of like extensions from what happened from the changes that Microsoft introduced in October 2022. So there's quite a lot there, and you can link them back and forth between October last year and this year.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, some good examples there of the impact on those changes. Back to you, Niamh. Intune, there's some changes on Intune, I believe.
Yeah, not any huge degree. Just they've added, you know, Intune endpoint privilege management as you user Excel to the availability tables, and then just updated kind of the license prerequisite table. So that's essentially, you know, the license that you need before you can go licensing Intune endpoint privilege or any of the new Intune point Plan 2, etc. And of course, Intune is now known as Intune P1 or Intune Plan 1.
Okay, good stuff. So I had a look at the next two changes on the list this month, which include project and software assurance benefits. So nothing major here to write home about, really mostly kind of focused on language changes as such. So if we look at the first one on project, Microsoft this month, they included some, I guess you could say, they've clarified the installation rights for project, taking into account the retirement of the QMTH program. So for those who weren't aware, Microsoft had this program called QMTH, or Qualified Multi-Tenanted Hosting Partner Program. What that program was for was to allow designated partners to host specific Microsoft applications that wouldn't necessarily have been covered by the traditional authorized outsourcer rules. So if you wanted to deploy Office 365 apps in a third-party data center, if they had this QMTH accreditation, it allowed you to do that and bring those licenses or whatnot to those hosting partners. As of October, we kind of touched on this in the last few minutes, and obviously we've talked extensively on this on some of our previous blogs and fireside chats. The flexible virtualization benefit, which Microsoft brought to market sometime around, I think it was October of last year, saw a raft of changes which brought about a huge level of flexibility in terms of how authorized outsourcers can use Microsoft technology that you bring to their cloud. As everybody knows, probably at this stage, authorized outsourcers are pretty much everything outside of the listed provider category. Listed providers being Amazon, or AWS, Google, Alibaba, and Microsoft call themselves a listed provider as well, Azure, but that obviously comes with their own special set of terms. So the change for project really is nothing major as such. It's just to reflect the retirement of QMTH. Those rights that you would have traditionally got with QMTH now really kind of come under the banner of your flexible virtualization benefit, which can be brought to bear if you're using a authorized outsourcer to host technology, be it shared or dedicated. And then the second one, the third one that I looked at was on software assurance benefits. So really what Microsoft have done is just a bit of a moving up the deck chairs here. There's a new page titled Purchasing and Reviewing Software Assurance, which gives you insights in terms of what benefits are included and so forth. So no changes to software assurance, mostly just a case of a new page being created in the product term site. So that about wraps things up for this month's overview of all of the Microsoft product licensing updates that were published as of the start of this month, April. As we do each month, we also look at Microsoft's licensing briefs that are out there in the ether. There's a couple of changes this month, some new briefs brought or published, should I say published, as well as some updates to some of the existing briefs that are out there for customers to access. Probably important to call out, I'll include links to all of these briefs in the associated blogs. So if if anyone wants to get a bit of a deeper understanding of what's included in each brief, because they're quite detailed. There'll be links in the blog to see where those to access those different briefs. The first one, Richard, I know you've had a look at the Azure Customer Solution brief. Anything of interest in that one?
Yes, Carl. I suppose there are two main things to call out here. The first one is the Azure Customer Solution was formerly known as the OSINT exemption, and the details of these are provided in the Azure product terms for our customers to look at. And then the second one is that there is a confirmation that if you're an on-premise hoster, you can use the Azure services under your own agreement to protect the on-premise servers with Microsoft Defender for Cloud, right? So there are a few scenarios, a few FAQs within this brief for our customers to read and to stay abreast of changes that happen within this space.
Okay, sounds good. I know, William, I kind of slightly touched on it when I talked about the project update, but outsourcing software management, the licensing brief for that.
Yeah.
Anything of interest there?
Just condensing all the new changes really to the outsourcing of software management, where they've classified it under two sort of main outsourcing options, which is deploying licenses to authorized outsourcers servers. So that's anyone outside of the listed provider list. And also just reinforcing the fact that you can still deploy licenses through license mobility to authorized mobility partners, which is slightly different to the authorized outsourcers. So it's probably worth having a read through the brief. It's only sort of 4 or 5 pages long, but there's some FAQs at the end about which sort of give scenarios on the changes that have come about since October 2022.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one to get your head around, right? Because I think it's one area that we see sometimes customers fall down on is BYOL. You know, depending on the deployment mechanism that you're using, that there may not be any safeguards in there to alert you if you're doing something outside of the licensing term. So no different to the on-premise world where you could load software without potentially having the right underlying license or the right type of underlying license. So really encourage people to have a look at that brief. There's some really useful information in there. Particularly around all, and take into account all the change that took place in October. It's good to get a refresh on that front, particularly if you're going to be using a third-party outsourcer. And then the last one, Niamh, so licensing Windows 365, Windows 11 virtual desktops for remote access. Licensing brief for that one. Obviously, there's some updates there this month. So anything of interest in that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, with so this is obviously virtual desktops, that are remotely virtualized as opposed to kind of local virtualization. But the brief it's 8 pages long, and it does cover like the 3 primary methods of Windows 11 being virtualized, and that's Windows 365, Azure Virtual Desktop, and desktops virtualized on on-premise servers or outsourced servers, and that one would be the one that I would come across most, in terms of my work. So the big one the big kind of like eye-opener for me out of the entire brief, and there's lots of, I think, really good stuff in it, is that the qualifying operating system. If you have Microsoft 365 suites, so that could be like an F plan, F3, E3, etc. And you basically don't need that qualifying operating system requirement anymore. If you're accessing a virtualized Windows 11 or Windows 10 kind of desktop, if that still remains. So if you have licensed by either Windows 11 E3, for example, or Windows Enterprise with Software Assurance, the device-based licensing, and also there's some interesting stuff on there about kind of VDA. So I guess like the key point with the dropping the qualifying operating system from Microsoft 365 suite customers is that they're now saying you don't need like a VDA license for someone who's accessing a virtual desktop from something like a Mac, or maybe from, kind of a terminal, etc. So yeah, interesting stuff there. And I think that is very much well worth a read, because that is something that's going to become more and more commonplace, I think, in the future.
Sounds pretty interesting. So yeah, so look, a ton of updates there this month, really. Now that I listen back to all these updates from everybody on the team, If you have any burning questions relating to anything Microsoft licensing related, or for that matter, if you have any other software licensing queries across a broad range of vendors, do feel free to reach out to the software asset management practice here at Version 1. We would be delighted to handle any questions that you might have. So watch out for our product licensing product update next month. And in the meantime, we'll continue to publish out relevant licensing content through our various different Medium blogs. So until next month's licensing update, see you then. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.